Before the advent of environmental regulations, industry used chemicals haphazardly. Although, under current environmental laws, chemicals are tightly regulated, and some are illegal to produce due to their toxicity, in the past, they were not seen as harmful to human health or the environment. In New England, where the American Industrial Revolution was born, legacy sites where chemicals were manufactured, used, and dumped dot the landscape.
What prompted everybody's attention towards the Fletcher Paint site was the Keys Municipal Well. Through routine environmental sampling by the state of New Hampshire and others, they found volatile organic contaminants in that municipal well, which caused a lot of problem because it provided drinking water for many residents in the town of Milford. They started to look for the contaminators, and guess what? Fletcher Paint was very close to that well, and that brought in the whole study to it.
This site is unique. It had been an industrial site since the 1800s, and there was a town dump buried underneath it. The Fletcher Paint Company had some side chemical businesses. They made pesticides, they made perfumes, and they made asphalt and roofing materials. EPA had to identify why there were so many PCBs associated with the paint facility because it wasn't typical. It was discovered that 3 companies were supplying a material called scrap pyranol, which is essentially a PCB material that comes out of capacitors or transformers. General Electric was Fletcher's largest supplier of this material. Fletcher's Paint was bringing the scrap pyranol in and shipping it out in products for asphalt and roofing companies.
Unfortunately, they had about 800 drums of hazardous substances placed on the parking lot, which was soil-based parking lot. The owners did not really know what the material was, and the drums were slowly rotting and the materials were leaking out. Very close to the river, so that was a threat to the river, a threat to the ground and the general area.
This site is located near businesses, residences, and an elementary school. The local Boys and Girls Club is just across the river. Once it was understood that Fletcher's Paint was the source of the contamination of the Keys Municipal Well, EPA began work to remove the leaking drums and conducted preliminary soil sampling. EPA did this work in 1988 via removal actions. Removal actions are typically short-term actions, about 6 months to a year in duration, to mitigate a more immediate threat. Removal activity in 1991, 93, 95, and 2000 also allowed EPA to address risks and manage building demolitions, fence installations, and contaminated soil removal from residences near the site.
It's one thing if you stay on your site, but if you have to come into their space, they're very afraid. We took a lot of time to work through those fears. One resident, he not only lived next to the property, had contamination in his property, in his house, he worked at the site. So he actually had his blood tested and had seen low levels in his blood.
Fletcher's Paint was listed on the National Priorities List, or NPL, in 1989. The NPL is another name for the Superfund program. Only the worst sites of pollution in America are ranked on the NPL, and funds are available through Congress to clean up these sites.
There's a number of entities that must come together in agreement to list a site for NPL.
In a lot of cases, a state discovers the site and assesses the magnitude of the problem, and if deemed necessary, the state will refer the site to EPA and request the site be ranked for the National Priorities List. In order for a site to be listed, it must meet certain hazardous ranking criteria. There are many factors involved in this decision, including the types and levels of contamination and their potential impacts. Ideally, the proposed NPL listing is supported by the governor of the state, the municipality the site is located in, and the community members there.
Once a site is listed, the typical Superfund process will involve a lot of field work to sample for the contaminants that may have been disposed of there, surface water and sediment sampling, soil sampling, air sampling. That information is used to compile a document we call a remedial investigation, which summarizes the contamination. As part of that remedial investigation, we do a risk assessment.
In the original scoping, you try to figure out what receptors they're called, what people or animals will be exposed to the chemicals. We were concerned about cancer and non-cancer effects of the PCBs and some solvents as well, whether there were long-term chronic effects of these chemicals in trespassers, child residents, adult residents, construction workers. The ecological receptors were primarily fish in the river. So we looked at the effects on the animals themselves in the river and on wildlife or humans who might eat the fish. And so that scopes out the risk assessment.
So when they went out of business in 1991, they left behind a large building full of hundreds of drums and miscellaneous materials. Because it was both a paint manufacturer, you could have an area of lead or antimony or chromium in one area of the site. You might have pesticides in another from that business. We never knew what the sample would show us because we never knew, what may have been disposed of in a different area.
Remedial investigation obtains the data. The risk assessor uses the data to calculate the risks. Then the engineers get involved in how much soil to take out, what is the method to remediate.
The remedial investigation serves as the basis for the feasibility study.
Feasibility study will evaluate the various options that are potentially viable for cleaning up the site, whether it's soil or groundwater or sediment. That feasibility study then provides us the basis to propose a cleanup strategy that public comment on, typically 30 days, and then we write our cleanup decision or a record of decision that documents how to clean up the site.
As the cleanup process progresses, EPA is tasked with other functions that move in concert to the cleanup. Part of EPA's job on Superfund sites is to ensure that polluters pay for the remediation of the site, which is done through EPA enforcement. EPA identifies the parties that are considered responsible for the contamination under the law and asks those parties to perform the cleanup. At the Fletcher's Paint Superfund site, EPA identified General Electric as the potentially responsible party, but GE contested. After the United States filed a lawsuit against GE, the company was found by the court to be a liable party.
The second phase of the investigations, the pre-design investigations, that's pretty discrete. Instead of taking a few samples that shows high levels of contamination, you're taking 3,800 samples to look at very discrete depths of contamination. Where is it pooling up? You're looking for how the data would respond to the cleanup.
Basically, we try to do pre-design work to design the remedy that was selected and ultimately clean it up and perform the cleanup.
The site is composed of two areas, the Mill Street site and the Elm Street site. Both sites are in active remedial action currently for the removal of contaminated soils, contaminated with PCBs, being transported off-site. Some areas are going all the way to bedrock and other areas are shallower.
The site is evaluated on an ongoing basis for remedy protectiveness to make sure it still protects public health and the environment.
During the early stages of the soil excavation, we were detecting very high levels of PCBs in the air, much higher than the project action levels that were established. So we worked with the PRP General Electric and their contractor to figure out ways we could adjust the way we were managing the site. Finally wound up with developing a new plan. Part of that plan required additional engineering controls. Some of those controls included spraying vapor suppressing foam on the site. We also increased the amount of air monitoring that we were doing and the amount of air monitoring stations that were needed on the project.
The community is encouraged to participate in the cleanup process, and engaging the community is a focus of the cleanup team.
We're going to start off tonight with a quick introduction. My name is Cheryl Sprague. I work with the Environmental Protection Agency. I am the Remedial Project Manager for the Fletcher Paint Superfund site. With me tonight is my boss, Chief of the New Hampshire Rhode Island Superfund section, Mike Jasinski.
The work really couldn't be done without interacting with the community. And on this particular site, we were literally within 6 inches of people's front doors, front steps. And that's where the excavation was happening. I think the community involvement coordinator, besides dealing with the community, is also intensely dealing with the team. We had our project manager, we met regularly, and one of the standing agenda items, one of the most important ones, is what are we telling people? How are we interacting with them? She understood that he was not going to be able to do his job without essentially talking to people almost every day.
As the site gets clean, the view of Keys Park and the Souhegan River has the town looking at the space differently.
And the town, who had always had an interest in a passive recreational use, but nothing fancy, has now become very energized in figuring out how to really reuse the site in a way that benefits the community and reconnects a portion of the community to the Souhegan River.
And I know the city of Milford had been upset and impatient, understandably, over the years, and now is very happy with the work that's being done. Since our enforcement efforts were successful, GE has been doing a great job in cleaning up the site and doing it fairly quickly. It's amazing to visit the site and see all the work that's going on.
Right now, we're digging up thousands of cubic yards of PCB contaminated material at Fletcher's, and eventually this site will finally get cleaned up. That's why I joined EPA. I felt like I could contribute to New England by going through this process to get a site investigated, studied, cleaned up, and put back into use somehow.
The former Fletcher's Paint Superfund site has become a public park for the citizens of Milford, New Hampshire.
The IceCube Neutrino Observatory at the National Science Foundation's Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica, the world's largest neutrino detector. A cubic kilometer of clear ice, armed with more than 5,000 light sensors arranged in a grid beneath the South Pole. One of its missions is to help solve a 100-year-old riddle. Where do cosmic rays come from? To do that, it looks for cosmic sources of high-energy neutrinos. Cosmic rays are high-energy charged particles born like neutrinos in some of the most cataclysmic events in the universe. But where cosmic rays are knocked around by the powerful magnetic fields that permeate interstellar and intergalactic space, neutrinos are ghostly subatomic particles that can travel usually unhindered in a straight path through galaxies, stars, and anything else nature throws in their path. So find a source of neutrinos, and you might have found a source of cosmic rays as well. The challenge? Neutrinos rarely interact with matter. But whenever a neutrino does happen to collide head-to-head with atomic particles of an ice molecule inside or near the IceCube Observatory, it creates secondary particles that, in turn, create a cone of blue light that IceCube's sensors detect. And that's what happened on September 22, 2017. IceCube's alert system flashed coordinates of a potential source of that neutrino to many telescopes worldwide to follow up with observations. And multi-messenger astrophysics went to work, scanning these coordinates for more information. Fermi, a NASA gamma-ray space telescope which had already observed enhanced gamma-ray activity from a blazar at these coordinates, and the Major Atmospheric Gamma Imaging Cherenkov Telescope, or MAGIC, in the Canary Islands, looked in the direction the neutrino came from and detected a burst of high-energy gamma rays from the blazar. These converging observations could mean only one thing. The blazar was the source of that neutrino. A blazar is a giant galaxy with a massive, rapidly spinning black hole at its core, and twin laser-like jets of elementary particles and light that shoot out from the poles along the axis of the black hole's rotation. And it seems that one of those jets was oriented towards our planet Earth. Because this blazar produces cosmic gamma rays and neutrinos, we now have evidence of a source that produces cosmic rays as well, thanks to multi-messenger astrophysics that helped solve a 100-year-old problem and revealed significant insights into objects and events far more powerful than any we will ever witness on Earth.
In 2017, a colossal chunk of ice roughly the size of the state of Delaware broke away from an ice shelf on the Antarctic Peninsula. The peninsula is warming at rates much greater than the rest of the planet, leading to large losses of sea ice, prime habitat for minke whales. Krill, which feed on algae and phytoplankton that grow on the underside of sea ice, serve as the main food for minkies. What will happen to krill-dependent animals and their ecological roles if sea ice disappears? This year, scientists from the National Science Foundation, UC Santa Cruz, Duke, Stanford, and NOAA traveled to the Antarctic Peninsula to study the case of minke whales. Using underwater echo sounders, drone photography, and whale-mounted video cameras designed to fall off the whales after a day or two, the team tracked the movements and feeding of the whales. Dr. Chris Taylor with NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science led the krill mapping using echo sounders to measure the location and size of krill swarms the minkies fed on. The information collected by the researchers is giving them a better idea of how much minke whale feeding occurs under sea ice, and ultimately of how climate change might affect this polar region.
Plastic is everywhere. A lot of it ends up in the ocean. Most plastics in the ocean break down into very small particles. These small plastic bits are called microplastics. Other plastics are intentionally designed to be small. They're called microbeads and are used in many health and beauty products. They pass unchanged through waterways into the ocean. Aquatic life and birds can mistake microplastics for food. Research is being conducted, but there's much we still don't know. In 2015, the US banned the use of microbeads, but microplastics are still a huge problem. You can help keep plastic out of the ocean. Remember, reduce, reuse, and recycle.
NASA's Parker Solar Probe is a mission to explore the sun. How can it do that? Why won't the spacecraft melt? Excellent questions. You can't face off with the sun without packing the right gear. This is why Solar Probe is equipped with a white shield that reflects heat off the front and keeps things cool in the back.
The heat shield is made out of a couple of different materials. One is carbon-carbon, which is a lot like the graphite epoxy you might see in your golf clubs or your tennis racket, but it's just been superheated. The inside is a carbon foam, which is just another form of carbon and is actually about 97% air. It's a very lightweight way of making a very strong structure.
Nobody likes a needy explorer. Solar Probe can take care of itself, thank you very much. And that's because it has autonomy software that will keep its instruments safe and cool behind the heat shield.
We're too far away to joystick it into place, so it basically has to always be sensing whether or not the heat shield is in the right position and correct itself if it isn't. There are these things called solar limb sensors that are just poking out at the very edge of the shadow, and if those get illuminated, the spacecraft knows, oh, I'm going the wrong direction, and can actually right itself.
It's important to stay hydrated in the sun, even for a spacecraft. Solar Probe circulates water to keep the solar cells from overheating. It stays cool and keeps power.
So basically water flows behind the solar rays and into the radiators, and so the water warms up when it's behind the solar cells and then cools down up at the radiators, and so that heat transfer is happening a lot like the veins in your body.
Yes, you read right. Heat is not the same as temperature. Temperature is a measurement, but heat is energy transfer. This matters because Solar Probe will be visiting the sun's outer layer, the corona. Like all stars, the sun is made of plasma. How tightly packed that plasma is depends on the layer. While the sun's corona has a very high temperature, the plasma particles are fairly spread out. So even though the temperature in the corona is 2 to 3 million degrees Fahrenheit, the heat around the spacecraft is manageable.
The corona and where we're going is actually not that dense at all. There are only a couple particles. And so when we think about it, those are very hot. but we're not touching a lot of them. It's the kind of like when you put your hand into an oven, and the oven might be at 400 or 500 degrees Fahrenheit, but your hand isn't at 400 or 500 degrees Fahrenheit.
Thanks to its design and destination, this cool, confident spacecraft is all set to explore. We can just sit back and chill as Parker's solar probe takes the heat.
So traditionally, most of what we know about sea turtles come from the nesting beaches. That's where we have easy access to the animals. Females come up on these tropical beaches and lay their eggs in warm sand, and the female green sea turtle, for example, will lay about 100 ping pong ball size eggs, and she may lay 2 to 8 nests within a season. However, the number of nesting females on a nesting beach is not always a good measurement of the overall health of a population. Today, conditions on nesting beaches are changing, and we're seeing a general trend of warming now. One of the really interesting things about sea turtle is that their sex is determined by the incubation temperatures of the eggs, with cooler temperatures producing more males and warmer temperatures producing more females. With only a few degrees can really alter the sex ratios of turtles' hatchlings.
We don't know a lot about sea turtle sex ratios, so it's really important to get that data to help us determine the abundance of the population, the sex ratio, the survivorship of different sexes. But figuring out the sex of sea turtles is not easy.
One of the big challenges that we have is that there's no physical characteristics that can be used to determine the sex of a sea turtle until it reaches sexual maturity, which is when the males develop a longer tail than the females. Most studies rely on measuring the temperature of nests to estimate the sex ratios that would have been produced given those temperatures. Another approach is to look at the sex ratios of sea turtles at a foraging ground.
The foraging grounds give us a unique opportunity to look at the overall population, because it's many years of different turtles being born on different nesting beaches which come to these foraging grounds. So you have immature turtles, which can be anywhere from 2 to 20 years old, and then you have mature turtles, which are generally 25 to up to 50 years old.
So this work is done in strong collaboration with the Australian Government and the Queensland Parks and Wildlife. And the foraging ground that we studied is called the Howick Group. It sits in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. And from previous research we've done, we know that 90% of the turtles originate from the 2 Great Barrier Reef populations, with roughly a 50-50% split. So a typical day in the field, we catch somewhere between 70 to 100 green turtles in a day. After the turtle is caught, we take it back to the boat, we measure and tag it. We also take a blood sample that we use to find out whether it's a male or female. And then we take a small tissue sample that we use for genetics to find out which nesting population these turtles belong to. What's quite unique about what we're doing is that once we apply the genetics and we can estimate the nesting origin of these turtles, we can actually calculate nesting population-specific sex ratios for different size classes. So one of the surprising things that we found in this study was that the overall sex ratios at the foraging ground wasn't that alarming. It was slightly female biased. But it wasn't until we applied the genetics that we saw that the turtles coming from the cooler southern nesting beaches were only moderately female biased, with about 65% female. However, the turtles coming from the warmer northern nesting beaches, we found this extreme female bias of 99% or more females in the young turtles, which means that virtually no male turtles were born from these nesting beaches.
So this information was unknown until now. Nobody's combined these techniques before to figure this out. And most sea turtles reach sexual maturity around 25 years old, and the immature turtles that we examined for this study are probably at least 5 years old. So we're thinking that we'll start to see this feminization of the populations coming into full effect in about 20 years from now.
However, a few male turtles really goes a long way. Because male turtles are polygynous, which means that they can mate with several females. It's important to remember that they've been around for 100 million years, they've outlasted the dinosaurs, and they've adapted to a changing climate through that whole time. However, the climate is changing faster now than it has ever. And so the questions that we're all asking is, will it be able to adapt, and will it be able to adapt fast enough? And I certainly hope so.
It can be kind of scary or overwhelming when you hear about charities that are scamming people. To promise services to veterans who need it and not deliver on that promise is reprehensible.
This is something that's going to affect the life of you and your family, and someone wants to play games for their own personal gain.
Scammers have little moral compass, and they're preying upon people's good hearts.
But don't let that keep you from giving. Don't let that scare you away from providing for others.
What makes a difference in your donation is that it gets to a legitimate charity. Ask questions about how your money's going to be used. Who exactly are you? Where are you located? And how much of my money is going to go directly to that program?
So that you know that you're giving money to someone that's really going to put your money into practice rather than their pocket.
Charity scams can come in a bunch of different sizes. If anyone calls and asks you to make a charitable donation by wire transfer, by prepaid card, stop. That's an immediate red flag. Go to ftc.gov/charity. There you'll find information on how to research to spot the good charities and how to identify the scammers.
We all have an opportunity to contribute to the greater community at large and make this world a better place.
Take your time, do the research, make sure your donation counts.
Another successful parachute test for Orion. How we're getting back to the moon. And an Apollo 11 virtual experience. A few of the stories to tell you about this week at NASA. We successfully tested our Orion spacecraft's parachute system recently at the U.S. Army Proving Ground in Yuma, Arizona. It's the 7th in a series of 8 tests to certify the parachutes for missions with astronauts. Meanwhile, another milestone for the program in Houston, the mock crew module for use in the upcoming Ascent Abort 2 test, was powered on for the first time. Ascent Abort 2 is a full stress test of Orion's launch abort system planned for April 2019.
In case you hadn't heard, NASA is going back to the moon.
A new vertical video on our Instagram takes you behind the scenes to show 5 ways we're working to get astronauts back to the moon in preparation for missions even farther into the solar system. To learn more about our moon and the agency's exploration campaign to return to the lunar surface and eventually send humans to Mars, go to nasa.gov/moon to Mars.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
July 20th marks the 49th anniversary of Apollo 11's historic landing on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Earlier this year, our spin-off publication highlighted Apollo 11 VR, a virtual experience made with NASA data. To mark the anniversary, here's a look at it in action. Immersive VR Education, a virtual reality-based education company, created Apollo 11 VR. The company used the trove of online NASA data, audio, and visual files from the Apollo missions to recreate the sights and sounds of the first moon landing in authentic detail. Developers also worked with Apollo 16 astronaut Charlie Duke, who tested an early version and helped improve the accuracy of the control panel for the final release. Apollo 11 VR is one of the many NASA spin-off products developed as a result of the agency's long history of transferring technology to the private sector. The SOFIA Flying Telescope completed 7 weeks of celestial observations from Christchurch, New Zealand. This deployment marked the first time the observatory's instrument that studies celestial magnetic fields was used in the southern hemisphere. The research could help astronomers better understand how magnetic fields affect processes that occur at the center of the galaxy and around newly forming stars. Observations made during the flights included the black hole at the center of our Milky Way galaxy, the Tarantula Nebula, supernovae, and more. That's what's up this week at NASA. For more on these and other stories, follow us on the web at nasa.gov/twan.